right? But anyway, so the test window will come open at noon today, and you can go in and take your exam. We've got about 10 slides, 11 slides left in this chapter. So as we move through these today, we'll finish this. When we do finish, I anticipate if we've got, just 10 or 15 minutes or something, we'll just call it a day. In the class, so we may get done a little early, we may not, right? So, any questions about the exam before I start lecturing? Everything should be the same as the first time around, just different questions, right? So, last time, Tuesday, we talked. We finished, right? We talked about who votes. We covered this, the demographics of voting in America and in Texas. We talked about the different reasons, right, that people give us for voting, and why those are good and useful and help us understand what motivates people to show up to vote. So that's kind of where we finished off, was moving through those ideas and topics. Today we're going to start talking a little more factual stuff. We're going to talk, start off, I'll just get going, right? Some of the history of suffrage, right, in Texas, having the right to vote, right, is determined mostly, of course, by U.S. Constitution, U.S. law, and history, and then, of course, the Texas history that it intertwines with as part of the U.S. history. So, we talked a little bit about, when we talked about Texas constitutions and where we came out of as Mexicans, right? And then we transformed over to the Republic of Texas, and the impact that the Mexican Constitution had on what we try to do from there. So we have a little different idea of Texas about participation and voting rights than a lot of the other parts of the U.S. did. But generally speaking, the big watershed moments of suffrage and who gets to vote legally, who has the right to vote, are determined by struggles and at the federal level. So obviously we start the United States off. The Constitution sets out who gets to vote, and in the U.S. Constitution, right, that was a very small subset of people living here, right? You were white, male, free, landowning, over the age, right, of a certain age, and which, effectively, the Constitution disenfranchised, or did not enfranchise, I guess is a better way to put it. Didn't take it away, just wasn't give it to them. Most of the people in the continental United States, and right, so people of color and women, right, completely shut out from suffrage at that time. Now, the actual rules about voting and holding the elections and the how those elections were organized, and when, to a large extent, they occurred, and how it is that you became eligible to vote within the states, were controlled by the states, right? The federal Constitution gave the authority of running elections actually to the state governments. And so, right, initially with 13 different kind of ideas about how to do this, and now 50 different sets of ideas. Now, the federal laws that come into play here, and constitutional elements direct the states to a good bit, but there's still an awful lot left open to the actual practice of putting on an election and bringing people in to be able to vote. And so the states have a lot of leeway in how to do this. And if you're watching the news right now, you're seeing a lot of states revamp or relook at their voting laws, right, and how those get implemented, and how elections are allowed to happen, and what the processes are that are approved or not approved, and especially around ideas like absentee ballots, polling places, registration deadlines, um, you know, ballot harvesting, so a lot of things are being reviewed at the state level, and they have a lot of leeway to look at that. And so we're seeing some of that now, and that will impact the ease at which people can vote. It will certainly impact the processes that people go through as they vote. The states do not, in that sense, though, have a right to grant suffrage or deny suffrage, right? Those are have now been all subsumed by federal law, constitutional law, right? We see, right, former slaves, right, of the United States through the Civil War amendments, given the right to vote, right, legally, right. The practicality and practice of it from 1865 to 1875, the federal government was in the South trying to ensure that former slaves and now U.S. citizens could vote. As Reconstruction ended and the federal government removed itself, all of those challenges to former slaves being able to vote, run for office, and participate in the electoral system, right? All of those barriers and prohibitions and things, the southern states started bringing those back up and effectively challenging their right to vote. And we see ourselves, right, 100 years later, right, with the Civil Rights Act, right, trying to still effectively extend the suffrage to people of color. And then, of course, right, women, 1920, right, we just celebrated this century mark of women being able to vote in the United States with the 19th Amendment. So that has been more effective than right, bringing people of color in. So we're now, the participation rate among women is the same and higher in a lot of cases than men as far as voting goes. So that's taken hold a little better than the Civil War amendments did in the extension of the franchise to people of color and former slaves. So we're still working on that, still challenged there in some places. And then right, then we lowered the age of voting from 21 to 18 with the 26th Amendment. So extending the franchise based on age there. That was 1965, maybe around there, that fast. Of course, what we have there is, right, the reinstitution of the draft, and we are drafting 18-year-olds into the military to go fight. And the argument's made, well, if they're 18 through 21, we're drafting them to go fight and defend our country or defend our values, and risk their lives, they probably ought to have the franchise right to vote to help pick the people that are making that decision about where to send them to war. So the extension of the vote down to 18-year-olds made sense given that. So at the point that we're at now legally, right, all U.S. citizens over the age of 18 have the right to vote in the United States, and all of the United States. And so that's a good thing, right? That we're there. Whether 18 is a good number or 21 is a better number or 16, right? We can debate at what point it is that people should right age into having this opportunity and responsibility. But we were probably pretty close on that, right? And then what we need to do now, of course, is be vigilant about how we protect everyone's right and ability to exercise their vote, right? And that's a little bit of where we still have problems. The focus has, of course, shifted since the passage of those amendments to whether people have the right to vote or not, to how easy we make it, what hoops we put into place at the state level, and whether those requirements and hoops are necessary, and whether they're applied the same, and whether they are discriminatory in the way that they are put into place or have effects. And probably one of the most prominent places that we have to look at on this issue is on the issue of voter registration. And this is, voter registration, of course, are the set of rules that guide us into identifying qualified voters, right? And setting aside those folks that are not eligible to vote. Because there are circumstances, of course, where you can lose your privilege and right to vote. And so, especially if it's, you're a convicted felon, right? A lot of states look at that as a disqualifying act, and so you lose the right to vote in a lot of states while you're in prison and paying off your penalty to society. And then at some point after that, you can register to vote again and get back in to voting. And states go about that differently, about when felons can do that. States also, though, have just different practices of going through the motions of getting registered. And it's kind of an interesting thing to look at, because the highest barriers to getting becoming eligible to vote and getting registered to vote are still in those same states in the South that form the Confederacy, right? The states that from 1865 through 1965 were actively passing laws and putting policies into place that discriminated against people of color, right? We had literacy tests, we had poll taxes, we had grandfather clauses, right? And all of these were put into place as a barrier to keep people of color from voting. And so and they were effective, right? We see participation rates for people of color much higher in the period of 1865 through 1875 than we do in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1920s. So they were making a difference. And the federal government was continually looking at this and trying to say, hey, this is not right, which is why the civil rights movement gained steam and supported that and pushed that and was responsible for getting the federal government to pass legislation and then enact that legislation, actually make it happen. The literacy tests were amazing. There are examples out on the web. You can go pull up an old, 1930s, 1920s literacy test that'll show you the test that was given to people. And the argument was that if you weren't literate, how could you be expected to understand policy and perspective and candidates' positions and read the ballot and vote and express yourself? And so the argument from the states was, right, you had to prove your literacy. And if you were literate, then you could vote. Which, if you took that out of historical context and you just said that people had to be able to demonstrate an ability to read and understand so that their votes carried some meaning, maybe there's something to that. But if you look at the literacy tests, they were not good. They were not objective. They were written so that the people that were grading them could determine who passed and who didn't pass from their own perspective and not on some objective level. And so essentially, if If the literacy test applied to everybody, and it usually didn't, but if it did, the people grading it would grade it in fashion to allow the people they wanted to vote, white folks, to pass, regardless of what was on the test. And the people they didn't want to vote, people of color, would fail regardless of what they did on the test. So that's a problem right there, right, that it was certainly applied unequally. Even worse is that you combine that literacy test with a grandfather clause that said something to the effect of, if your grandfather had the right to vote at the time this literacy test was put into effect, you are exempt from having to take the test. Right? So we know exactly what that meant, right? If your white forefathers had the right to vote, so do you. Whether you can read or write, your literacy doesn't matter. It was a history, right? If you had the history of voting in the past because your white forebears were legal to vote, then you do too. And if you didn't have that, then we would apply this literacy test to you. I mean, it was just crazy, right? The discrimination that was being put into place through these laws. All of that, of course, was eradicated. 24th Amendment, Equal Rights Protection Clause was right to make sure that all people's right to vote were equally protected. The federal government was going to ensure that the states did their job and opened up polling and voting to folks. Still a challenge, right? We're still today doing the same kind of things, not as blatantly as registration laws were in the past. Here's the current set of pertinent laws for voter registration in Texas. So most of these are right, because of federal legislation and because of federal intervention, these are decent laws, right? This registration law in Texas makes some sense. You can register through mail or in person. So you can go on the internet and tell them to send you a ballot. They will, a registration form, and they will. You can fill that out and mail it back in. You can go to the county offices and do that. You can do that in the DPS offices with motor voter legislation. So when you're going to get your driver's license, you can fill out a registration card. They're supposed to ask you, right? Do you need to register? Right? Have you just moved here? Has your mailing address, your home address changed? If so, right, re-register to vote because you may have moved between precincts or something. Once you're registered in Texas, if you do not move, that registration is permanent, right? As long as the information on it as to where you live stays the same, you do not have to re-register. Unless, right, the government decides to purge the voting rolls of people who haven't participated in any elections. In other words, they have the opportunity under state law to at times go through and say, anybody that hasn't voted in the last, and I don't know the number, but let's say 4 elections or 5 elections, right? At a federal, when we're having a federal election. So you're talking, 15, 20 years. If you haven't voted, we're going to clear your names off the registry. And in a sense, right, for maintaining a good list and keeping track of who people are and where people are, there's good reasons for this. The downside, of course, is that just because you haven't voted doesn't mean that you shouldn't be made to re-register, right? But that's the effect of it. So if you haven't, right, they clear these voter rolls of people who haven't voted, but you haven't moved, you were properly registered, you're now not registered anymore, and you're going to have to know that. Now, it's bad when the state does this and doesn't tell you, right? So usually there's a requirement that everybody that's been identified as to be pulled out of the polls has to be notified that that's happening so that they can say, wait, I'm still here. Don't take me off the polls. And sometimes that happens the way it's supposed to, and sometimes it doesn't. In Texas, we have a requirement to be eligible in an election. You have to have been registered 30 days prior to that election, right? So what that means is that if you move and that 30 days before, you're going to have to go vote in the previous precinct, although you shouldn't legally, right? Or you're going to have to not vote at all until you get your registration changed. But usually most people, right, they go to their former precinct and they vote based on where they were most of the time. Requirement, be a U.S. citizen, a requirement to be 18 by election day. That's a nice one because it allows you to actually register when you're 17. I think it's 6 months prior to an election. If you're going to turn 18 before the election, right, that allows you to get registered and be eligible to vote on when you're 18. So you need to be a resident of your state, resident of your county for 30 days prior to the election. Precinct move is right. Each county's got 4 precincts in it. You move between precincts, you're usually fine. It's the move between counties that, right, different practices and stuff. They want that to be clean. And then, of course, we have our convicted felon exemption here, right, or exception, not exemption, exception, and the requirement that you either not be convicted at all, or if you have been convicted, that you've completed your sentence, and you're going to have to probably re-register to vote and prove that you've completed your sentence, which is not just time in jail, but also fines and probation and any kind of after sentence work. Andrew, yes.
That was one thing reading about that when we were reading that once they finish their sentence, they can vote again. How different is that, like, I guess, everywhere else, I suppose? 'Cause that was the first time I ever heard that one.
It's very different state to state.
Yeah.
Some states have laws that allow felons in prison to vote.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that at all.
Okay. There are a couple states that do that. Most states require you to not be in prison any longer.
Okay.
Some states require you to not be in prison and to re-register. Some require you to not be in prison, re-register, and have completed paying your fine that went along with that punishment. Right.
So I know that there are definitely some that I'm not positive it's this way in California still, but it was that if you were a felon at all, you can't vote. And
yeah, that used to be the case for a lot of states as well, that you lost the right to vote, period.
I guess
most states, I think, have changed that now.
Yeah, I guess my question is, like, if that were, I don't know if it's still that way in California, but say you're a felon in California, you lose your right to vote, you move to Nevada or Texas or anywhere that does somewhere that once you're a felon, you finished your sentence, you can vote again after you re-register. Would the sentence from said state that requires you to not be able to vote after you're a felon deter you from being able to vote in the new state?
No, the law that applies to you is the state that you're a resident of.
Okay.
So now that state may look back at the California records to make sure that you did complete under their state law, right, and have cleared everything, and then they'll let you vote. But it's the law of the state that you're in determines your eligibility.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, if in this last presidential election, we saw a lot of interest in this in Florida, right? Because Florida was trying to make sure that everybody that was a felon, a former felon, had paid their fines before they could register to vote, which was the law.
That's a lot of them.
And then there was a group, an outside group, that came in and paid these people's fines for them.
Really?
Yeah, and it was like several $1 million, a lot of millions of dollars, and there were a lot of celebrities and people that were donating money to this cause to allow them to vote. And the state was like, wait a minute, that was part of their punishment. right? You can't pay for
Yeah,
their penalty. They're supposed to. That's part of the punishment, and that went to court, right? And gosh, I don't remember if we saw the result of that or not. I don't
that's
remember.
that's real sneaky.
Well, yeah, because you're looking at. I mean, it's two things, right? There's two different ways to look at it. One, people that have nothing to do with maybe that state's elections and those policies and stuff are playing a part in who gets to cast a vote by paying their penalties off. On the other side, though, um, if there's in a sense, the payment penalty is a stiffer penalty on poor people than it is on rich people, right? And in that sense, it's not as fair, right? If I were a rich person and got convicted of a crime that carried a $20,000 fine as well as say 6 months jail time, and I was a poor person that got that same exact penalty, the penalty was applied fairly, but it's much easier for me as a rich person to pay that fine. It's not as big a deal to me, and to get my voting rights back quicker, right, than the poor person. And should our criminal penalties depend upon, and the impact of them depend upon how rich you are? That seems a little, I don't know.
Unfair.
Yeah, unfair, I guess, right? You both broke the law, right? You both are going to, even if the state's trying to be even on this and treat everybody the same, when you add a financial penalty on there, now you're bringing in something that, right, introduces capriciousness in a sense, right? It's technically fair to both of them, but it's much bigger burden on one than the other,
Well,
right?
I suppose this
So
may
there's
not
arguments to be made there, is all I'm saying.
this may not be based in truth, this next thought, but it's at least seems this way, that when you see someone who's I don't know, a celebrity or someone who's a very known wealthy person, when they get in trouble for something that they're going to serve jail time for, at least I feel like a lot of the time we see them not serving jail time and instead paying a heftier fine.
That's almost certainly true.
Okay.
I can't point to anything right now that would say, here's the stats on it. But from just a practical perspective, think about it this way. A rich person gets accused and convicted, or gets accused of a crime,
Uh-huh.
and they go out and hire
Yeah.
the
lawyers.
best representation possible.
Yeah.
A poor person hires the representation they can afford,
Yeah.
right? And that in and of itself is probably going to make a difference on the outcome, right? And that attorney that the rich person, right, hires is going to certainly be floating different ideas in front of the court about punishment and payments and fines and jail time, and right, because they've got a lot more resources to work with and to make those kind of right plea bargains, especially, right, that will change things. And right, the poor person with the same charge doesn't have as many options because they're poor. And there's no doubt that our justice system is responsive to the quality of representation you get, and the quality of representation you get is directly related to what you can afford.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yes, I expect the richer people to get if you can see me, a fairer shake by the legal system than a poorer person. And that's just wrong. But when you're responsible for, the state provides a minimal level of representation, but you have the opportunity because you're rich to get better. You're going to get better results from that, right? There's just no doubt. Robert, what did you say? The rich don't get punished. If you're poor, you've probably experienced, right? That's definitely your perception. I don't know that I'd go that far, right? I think it would be equal, but it would be harsh on everybody. Um, Definitely the pay for the college admission thing, right? So, yes, it makes a difference, right? I was actually surprised that she got 2 months, to be honest. Um, so Lauren says here, was the groups that paid the fines like a PAC type group or more? I think it was more social justice that sprung from a PAC. So a PAC was the one responsible for saying, hey, here's a problem, and a social justice group said, here's a solution. And on Tiger, right? I mean, um, they did not. It's correct that they didn't test him for drugs and alcohol. They had no reason on the scene to believe that, right? It's certainly possible at the time of day he was traveling, he simply fell asleep. It's also certainly the case that a rich, famous celebrity gets more benefit of the doubt than somebody else, right? And so now, if there had been drugs in the car, that right, if there had been alcohol in the car, he'd smelled of alcohol or something like that, then you would expect the authorities on the scene to have chased that because there would have been evidence of that. I don't know that you chase it if there's not something to lead you that direction, right? And I think too, even if we took the celebrity part of it, the fact that it was a single vehicle accident and no one was hurt except the driver, that in and of itself, for a lot of accident investigations, you tend to, and I'm speaking of this having looked at it from the police side of it, right? Accidents investigations are a lot of times a huge waste of time, effort, and money on the part of the police, right? There are other things that are more important they need to be doing than trying to figure out, right, in a single vehicle accident, just how culpable the person was, right? Now, if Tiger vehicle had hit somebody or another car or something, I think that changes the scope of that investigation a lot, right? Yeah, I won't get you started on Zuckerberg. Yeah, let's see, Riley, hit and run. Yeah, so that's good, right? I mean, I'm sorry, it's not good that your sister was hit. It's good that they were testing the blood work for the drivers. So, right, because there's more than just one here, and so it's a good thing that they're following through on the investigation there. And like Andrew, I hope she's okay as well. Hope everybody's okay in that. So, I mean, yeah, there's no doubt that money and reputation and celebrity, all of that matters on this felon part of the issue. Moving on a little bit, right? One of the other things that we need to know is that, and look at, is that, well, given these registrations and the practice and processes in Texas, how do we, how does that affect us, and what's our turnout look like, and is there an impact from this? And one of the things that we know is that Texas generally is considered one of the more stricter registration states as far as its laws goes in the U.S. Right? It's a little harder to get and stay registered in Texas than it is a lot of other states. I mean, you've got Oregon or Washington, one of the two, who automatically register you to vote, right, when you turn 18, right? They have all that information, right? They know when you were born, they know where you're living pretty much, right? If that information is all clean and clear, the state just registers you to vote, right? It's simple. They don't, they're just looking at the data and say, okay, that's good. You're registered to vote, and they mail you your registration card. All right, Texas could do that too, but we don't, right? We don't because, right, if you go back to that idea about Texans and their individuality and their freedom and their responsibility for their choices. You want to vote, right? You got some things you need to do, right? That's our perspective on it. The government doesn't need to help you get ready to vote, right? Whereas in Oregon, the government says, hey, right, we want everybody to vote, so we're going to register you, right? When we look at text, and I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention to the rest of this over here about the driving intoxication and breathalyzers and all that, right? So, so you can have your conversation there. I'm not going to weigh in on that. So when we look at voting in Texas, we look at turnout in Texas, what we see is that we're not very good in relation to the country as a whole, but we're getting better. Okay, so this is older data, but it's accurate. It goes through 2012 on the presidential elections. So we've got the 16 election and the 20 election that's not in here. But what we see going back in time is that we generally perform at a 20% less effectiveness as far as voting than the country as a whole. But right, we're getting better at it, right? We're getting closer. We're within 5 to 10 percentage points of the country now, and I would imagine in this last two elections that it's even closer, at least in presidential elections. Our turnout in non-presidential years is even worse. It is worse at the national level as well. As you can see, generally it's a 15 to 20% drop between voting during a presidential election year and voting during a midterm election. And so, it makes sense to look at the midterm elections at the House U.S. level, because there's no president to look at. There may be no senator to look at, depending upon where they are in their 6-year terms. So you're looking here at the House results only for the U.S. and Texas to give us a trend. And we could look at this every 2 years, of course, right? Because we have House elections every 2 years as we work through this. But four works for more recently. So you look through this, we're getting better here too. We've gone from 20% participation rates in the House elections to we're 30 plus now. The national average is dropping. So Texas is getting actually a little more involved. We've been higher, right? You see there 94, we had a 35% participation rate. So we are, and this is true of most of the southern ex-Confederate states, participating at a lower level than the rest of the states in the country. Part of that is because, of course, in this deep-seated perspective of not trusting the federal government, right, which is a result of our Civil War heritage and our Reconstruction experience. So that matters. The other thing, though, that comes out here that's important for us as Texans looking at voting is that education and income, right, are really, really important factors as to whether people vote. And it makes sense when you think about it a little bit, right? Because if you have, as a state, a large poor population, they're going to face more challenges when they vote than well-educated and well-informed or well-financed people, right? People with more income. And we talked about this some when we talked about the demographics of voters earlier, right? If you're having to clock out and lose money, you're having to find babysitters for your kids. You're having you can't clock out and you have to vote in the hours before you go to work or after you go to work. All of those factors constrain people from voting and make a little higher barrier for them to vote than, say, if you've got a job like me where I'm partially retired and right? I get time every day that I've got free time. I can go vote. It's no big deal, right? Um, and so, I've got the opportunity to do that. Government employees are given time to go vote. Some big corporations give their employees time to go vote. And if you're working at an hourly job where you're clocking in, you may not get that, right? And so it's if you're poor, you have to expend more effort and to be able to exercise your right to vote. And because of that, some people choose not to, right? They say no, and you can't blame them for that, right? Um, the less educated tend not to vote because maybe less educated and poorer right are tied together, and the economic factor matters. But also they have less reasons in their head about why they should vote or what the impact of voting is going to be, right? They're less educated about it. Hopefully classes like this, right, educate people that it's important and you can make a difference and you should put the effort out there. But a whole lot of people don't ever get exposed to the reasons why people should vote and the cost of voting and how it makes a difference. And so their analysis is different. They're like, well, I don't really see any difference anyway. It's a waste of my time. I ain't got anything in common with those folks. I'm not going to do it, right? It looks like Elijah's on topic here, so let's take a peek. I had a coworker who was trying to explain to me that it's okay for overworked people who can't register to vote to exist because they don't have the time to understand how things work. So basically asking for, I'm not manorialism. I don't know what that is, Elijah. Oh, okay, gotcha. Right. Being serfs on the manor. I got it. Okay. Yeah. It's, wow, that's a depressing perspective, right? That because this is the lot in life you have, you shouldn't try to change it. You shouldn't try to vote. You should just live with it. Yeah. No, I can't disagree with that strongly enough. Every person, right? And this is, I guess I'm getting on a little soapbox here, but every person has an inherent worth, right? And the whole point of this democracy thing is that we get to express that and have some kind of ingress into the system that's making laws that help us and or sometimes restrain us or hurt us. And so, boy, I just think that's not right. Your coworker needs to be educated as to the importance of them. Okay. Well, now this is a little different now when you add that kind of context, because now he's making an elitist argument, probably arguing that he would have the right to vote and should have the right to make decisions for other people. That's a little different perspective. Yeah. So he's coming at it from an elitist perspective that only the educated, only the ones that have experience and perception should be able to vote because they'll make better decisions, and the less educated and the less wealthy should just take their lot in life. Spoken as someone, right, that certainly wants that responsibility for determining other people's lives. That's not unusual, to be frank. There's a very strong strain of elitism. Heck, you look at the U.S. Constitution, and that's exactly what we're seeing there, right? In that first runabout, is that that was a very, very elitist and aristocratic perspective on why the franchise was given to white property-free males, right? It's exactly because of that. And it shouldn't surprise us that people still have that perspective. And I have to admit to at times feeling that way a little bit myself, right? It's like, gosh, why are these people voting this way when it doesn't help them at all, right? They've bought a team concept, but they're not paying attention to the policy that comes out of it, and they're voting against their own interest. The other side of that, though, is that if you're going to really believe that people have their own rights and their own responsibility for themselves, then you have to let them make their decisions for themselves. You can put the education out there, you can put the information out there, but at the end of the day, if we're really championing these ideas that individuals have rights and protections for them, we need to let them exercise it. So yes, that's what this class, I hope you take away, is all about, right? That as Americans, you have these rights. Here's a lot of information that goes along with those rights so that you can exercise them better, right? More information provided is a good thing as long as it's not slanted to one position or another, right? Here's what we know as facts. Wow, I've got an itchy nose. Here's what we know as facts. Take that and run with it, right? Apply it to your own life. And we needed to let people do that, right? Give them an easy ingress to the system if they're citizens, and then let them express themselves. Well, there is the argument there that there's a responsibility to educate yourself. The only caveat I would add to that is that education and income impact that ability, right? If you're working 2 jobs to put roof over your house, over your family, and food on the table, you have a lot less time to be able to exercise the education part on your own and be responsible for it. Not that you can't, right? But the burdens are higher, the barriers are higher. And so it's going to be a little harder, right? That's the whole point, right? Is it's not trying to, as you're saying, Robert, the point is to get you in a position where you can change your mind based on what you're reading and experiencing, and not always have to rely on others to provide that for you, right? And so that's what I'm hoping from a class like this, is that it lets you, right, do that. You know, for the longest time in history, serfs, slaves, sharecroppers, right, were prevented from being able to get education, from becoming literate. And it was probably the biggest and best tool that elites had of keeping other people out of the political process, which is why the literacy test is such an abominable thing, right? Because what you're doing is giving people the idea that they're in control of their own lives, but if they don't have the tools to actually exercise it, it's just a fake promise. And so that's why it's important when you see things like in the Texas Constitution, right, the leadership of Texas saying Texas believes as a whole that people have a right to a certain level of education. And Texans as a whole believe that we ought to provide funding to ensure that level of education is there, right? Because what that's doing is putting a base level set of tools out there so that people can be literate and can read and can learn, and then follow the political process. And so, you know, for the longest time, if you look back at the southern slave states, one of the biggest ways, besides physical coercion, that we kept slaves from becoming, all right, realizing their potential and becoming a part of society, is we kept them illiterate intentionally, right? And you can see slave owners talking about that, and you know, they're writing letters and talking about that keeping people illiterate is absolutely a way to keep a control over their life. And it's no different now. That, you know, if you can keep information from people or you can hide information from people, they can't make good decisions if they can't get access to it. Now, there's still, right, we're Texans, there's still a responsibility on the individual to get out there and look for it and dig for it and read it and understand it and conceptualize it. But to have some kind of institutional practice or law that prevents it, doesn't assist people to be good citizens is right, not good. So given that, we shouldn't be surprised that minorities, people that have been historically discriminated against in the United States and in Texas still participate at lower levels than those that have had a much longer history of practice of being in politics and voting and running for office. It's still there, right? We still have a legacy of that. And, we look at the way Texas implemented their voter ID law, and we see that same impact was of requiring that voter ID, that photo ID to be able to vote, was a higher barrier on the poor and the elderly than it was on anybody else in Texas. And that kind of law and that kind of implementation is a thing we got to fight against, right? Yes, right? Yes, Robert. Lying politicians are a problem, definitely a problem. And so we have a responsibility to educate ourselves about that and to hold them responsible for the truth of what they say or don't say. So you're going to go on here to make the argument that the tools is not enough, huh? I argue that it isn't enough in democracy just to give tools to the people to educate themselves. Modern day life is too fast and pace and too many things to worry about for people to focus on this, which is why I think these things should be mandatory to be taught in school before people have to worry about just surviving. Yeah, it's certainly important, and I would think, having done this in the high school level, that I could argue we do a decent job of presenting how the system works, right? As a community college teacher, quite often, probably a third to a half of our classes are taught in high schools. We actually go into the high school as college professors and teach them, right? Texas government, U.S. government. And so now I can't say this 20 years ago, but now I can say that at least in that area where we are trying to take that message down earlier. Unfortunately, in some sense, it's only being delivered to advanced placement students a lot of times, right? Which are the students that probably need it the least. And so in that case, we're dependent upon civics and how government works to be taught in the high school by high school curriculum designers. And I don't know that we have a requirement that high schools teach that. I think it's more optional through the AP thing. So there might be something there to look at, right? Last couple slides here. We know that in Texas, turnout is lower, right? Most educational standards are based on either federal or Texas state standards. So why it's important to you to pay attention to elections for school boards, right? In Texas, the school board is elected, right? So both at the independent school district level and at the Texas State Board of Education level, right? We've split Texas up into 15 districts, and we elect a person from each district to serve on the Texas State Board of Education. So if you want to see education standards getting pushed into these education standards put into the required state curriculum, it's important to vote people in at those state board levels so that because they're the ones that set most curriculum policy, at least the standards for the state of Texas. So let me get back on this. I want to finish these slides because you're going to be tested on them. We'll get back to talking about the State Board of Education when we talk about bureaucracy. So we'll have another shot at education standards and who sets those and how that works a little later. The history of Texas is such that for the longest period of time, Anglos controlled and determined election results and registration laws and where the polls were, how we did elections. And so Texas's history and Texas' current position, policy-wise, is that those Anglos who were in power and wealthy, most of them were the ones that are setting policy and laws in Texas because they were the decision makers. And they were conservative, and they are conservative. And so that's where, as a whole, we're coming at this. We're very conservative. And you've got to remember that those folks in power want to stay in power, and they will do anything that they can do that's definitely legal, and maybe some things that are questionable there, to ensure that the system is set up to assist them, and at best, not assist others. May actively deter them, but at best will not assist them, right? And in there and try to preserve their power and their perspective. In Texas, that means a conservative perspective. In other states, it might be different. And it doesn't matter in many cases where you're talking Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. The groups that are in power will tend to work to preserve power for themselves. That's human nature, right? And to expect anything different, I think, is to be a little fluffy in your thinking, right? So, right, we need to understand that that's just the human nature. That's the nature of power. It's the way it works, and it's so to change things is hard. Period. Right? To change things is hard, and it takes a coordinated effort. All right, so fun question here toward the end. Does it make sense to vote? We've got this commentary going on over the side over here about getting people to vote, education to vote. All of that argument is only made if you think that your vote matters and can make a difference, right, when you cast it. And again, from an economic perspective, right, a cost-benefit analysis is an interesting way to look at this. Given the requirements, given the barriers, given the cost of voting, does your vote make enough of a difference to justify those costs and overcoming those barriers? If the answer is no, then rationally you should not vote, right? Most of us answer this question from the perspective of yes, it does matter. And it matters enough that I'll put out the effort. And there's another element here that kind of undercuts the rationality argument, and it's this belief in ourselves and our ability to make a difference in the world, what we call efficacy. A good bunch of us believe that one motivated person being stubborn and diligent in trying to change things can. And our system is set up so that that opportunity, while it's not easy, is there, right, for a person to make a difference. And so your vote alone, maybe not, but you're out there encouraging others to vote and get involved and make a difference, then you're starting to talk about change. So we can look at voting based on a strict cost versus benefit analysis, or we can also look at it from a perspective of the values we actually hold and how that motivates us to vote, maybe regardless of the efficiency, right? So efficacy, right, is different from efficiency. Efficiency is, right, spending the least and being most to get what you need to be done. Efficacy is being able to get it done, right? To make a difference, to make an impact. And the other element here is an element of trust in our political system. If we participate, if we exercise our voices, if we get involved, Do we have enough trust in our system that it will actually respond to that? Will it respond? Do we have history? Do we have expectations? Do we have a belief that our democracy is such that it will bend and change to the will of the people as they get involved? And I would argue for that, there are certainly groups of us out there that have become disillusioned. But if you look at this last year and you look at, right, the protest and the involvement and the insurrections, and those things don't happen from people that don't have either a level of efficacy in themselves or a level of trust that the system will respond. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get involved, how we participate, and then talk about how that translates into action and change. What I have here on this slide is a list of 7 ways to participate politically. These are arranged from the one that we do the most to the one that we do the least, right? From basically easiest to most complex. And so, right, let's go through them real quick. There's nothing difficult to understand about what these types of participation are talking about. But once we understand what participation, how it categorizes itself, we can talk about the level of effort needed. Voting. All it takes in Texas and the United States to vote is that you meet the requirements and you register and then you show up to vote. Are there challenges to that? Yes. In controversial elections where we have polarizing candidates, we see 60-65% of our population that's eligible to vote voting. So that there are barriers there, sure. Can they be overcome? If 65% of them are, then yes, they can be overcome. So voting is the easiest way we have to make a direct impact on the system. And I think it's fair enough to say that our voting is generally transparent enough that we know, right, who the winners and losers are, and the data is there to back it up. Now, of course, we just had some challenges on that in this last presidential election, but I haven't yet to see any hard data challenging that the votes cast weren't actually votes that cast. So we'll see, right? I'm sure we'll see some more of that play out in the future. Second way that we can participate is by contacting politicians. What this means is as a constituent, right, you're reaching out to your representatives, either phone, email, letter, right, personal visit, right? These don't take an extraordinary amount of effort to do that. Now, you're not probably going to get direct contact with your representatives. You're probably going to get contact with their staff. But that's good enough, because I can tell you from being on the other side that representative staff catalog every contact, what it's about, who it was from, if that's given, whether they were elected constituent or a constituent that voted or not, where they are, and all of that is categorized and compiled and presented on a weekly basis, generally to those folks that are in office, so they know who's contacting them and what's driving them. So your contacts are logged. They're paid attention to. And if you're a donor or something like that, you may get some personal attention. If you happen to go to an event or something, you may get some personal attention. But generally, you're going to be working through staff. That's the second easiest way to try to impact the system and participate. Third would be to communicate. This communication is referring to communication that you have to other people, other voters, other people, and what we're looking at here is having meetings, group meetings, voter meetings, party meetings, your neighborhood meetings or something where you're organizing a group of people to do something. You're involved, right, in getting the message out through, whether that be email or having, right, something where people show up and But the idea here is that you're talking politics with other people, not just, general chit chat kind of stuff, but hey, right, we've got an issue. What do you think about it? What should we do? That requires a little more effort, a little more organization, a little more work. The next step up is where you as an individual start participating politically in campaigns. Usually what we're talking about here are campaigns, policy campaigns or electoral campaigns, where you're volunteering time, effort to help a campaign, donating money to a campaign, right? So higher level of participation than just talk. So that's pretty clear cut. Next one requires a little more explanation, and this is being a community activist. Being a community activist means that you as an individual, and maybe as a part of a group, are working on a routine basis to get the concerns, issues, and problems of the community you're a part in front of, right, decision makers. That you're out knocking doors, talking to people, putting out flyers, organizing meetings, and then getting that information and results of that to decision makers to say, hey, here's our issues, and you need to be looking at us as a group to, and solving these for us. This is a pretty high level of engagement, right? Participation. The next level up is participation based on protest. And protest, there are three kinds of protest out there that require different levels of engagement. The first type of protest is the protest that we generally see on the evening news, where community activists and communicators and stuff have organized a protest, gotten a permit from the city to have a protest and a march or a sit-in or gather someplace to have a public spectacle that can get information and a perspective and a position out in public. And so if you're looking at Austin, the way this generally occurs is that you go to the city and you request a permit, and the primary protesting area in Austin is first the state capitol grounds, which is considered a free speech area. And then a lot of people get permits to march up Congress Avenue to the state capitol. And the city, right, will work hard to try to accommodate that kind of legal protest, right? You're there wanting to get the permits to do it. They're obligated to do their best to try to ensure that you can. You're probably not going to get a permit to march on Congress at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning. Just not going to happen, right? But 9 or 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, yeah, it's going to happen, right? And you're going to be able to protest, and there will be police there to keep the situation safe and traffic out of the right areas. That's the base level of protesting. It's all legal, and what you're doing there is just a more exaggerated form of communication, right? Second level of protesting requires a little bit more engagement, is what we call civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a very special brand of protest where you're not protesting for or against just policy per se. You're usually protesting against law that's in place and law that is considered by your group to be unjust, right? That's treating people unfairly, unequally, and needs to be changed. And quite often, civil disobedience is the act of peacefully breaking that law and then voluntarily paying the penalty for breaking that law. This all has to go together as one big experience and participation, right? You look at civil disobedience and you see people, right, not getting a permit to march, right, necessarily, maybe, but not usually, marching and breaking the law, right, sitting at the front of the bus, right, breaking the law. And when the law comes to, right, exercise its power and punish you for breaking the law, you're going to go peacefully to that punishment, because paying the price, doing the punishment part of it should send the stronger message of how unjust this law was to begin with, which is why you get Martin Luther King writing the letter from the Birmingham jail, right? Protested, arrested, went to jail, then wrote about the experience to explain to people why this was important and how to peacefully protest while doing an illegal activity, right? So it's an awful lot of dedication to the point that you're trying to make. And the reason I spend time pointing this out is it's obviously a step beyond just protest marching, right? You're breaking a law. The other one, you're not doing anything illegal. Here you're breaking a law, but you're also paying the penalty as part of this demonstration, which separates it from the third type of protesting, which is illegal protesting that carries a political message, but doesn't necessarily have any responsible intentions behind it. So when we see rioting, when we see property destruction, when we see, right, people breaking laws and hurting people and hurting their property and things like that, and then they're obviously, right, going to try to get away and not pay a penalty, right? That's still political protest. It still takes an immense amount of dedication to getting that issue out there. And the protest sends a political message, up to and including civil insurrection and assassination and war. Right? Because it sends a political message, it is political participation. Because it's outside the bounds of legality and it's not recognizing the laws and such like civil disobedience does, it's very radical. If you get caught, you're gonna get punished, right? And the actions you're probably engaged in are of a higher risk and going to bring higher punishment because of that, right? So it's a high level of dedication here. There's also a belief that these kind of actions can change things, right? I like to look at it from a very extreme perspective as an explanatory perspective, and that's like political assassinations, right? You assassinate a political individual, that's sending a message. That's sending a political message. No one disputes, right, that, you're John Wilkes Booth and you kill the President of the United States, you assassinate the President of the United States. Message delivered. So it is political and it is participation, and it's outside all the bounds of normal behavior, right? And you're going to die when you get caught for that, right? Which tells you the level of engagement, right? The last one here is complete activist. This is just someone that's so committed to the political participation, they will do all of these previous things, right? They vote, they contact, they campaign, they're an activist, they protest, right? That's a complete activist who's working on all cylinders here, right? So these are the ways that you can certainly participate. This last slide combines the ideas of political efficacy and political trust with the types of participation. The idea here is that your level of political efficacy, how much you believe you can make a difference in the system, and your level of political trust in government to respond, right, to your input, to your participation, will to a large extent determine the type of political participation you're willing to engage in. So you see here we have conventional, we have no participation, and we have unconventional. So let me back up a slide and show you conventional participation, right, ensconces voting, contacting, communicating, campaigning, and community activists, and the first legal version of protesting. Unconventional activity political activity starts with civil disobedience and then unlawful protesting, right? And the complete activists that would take part in those. So your unconventional happens in version 2 and 3 of protesting. Conventional is the first version of protesting, and these that are above it. So going back over here, if as a person you have a high level of political trust, so in other words, you think, if I get involved and work hard, the government will respond to my participation. I can make, right, it will listen to me. And high level, right, of political trust, political efficacy, you believe you can make a difference, right? So you put those two things together. I can make a difference. The system will listen to me. The only modes of participation you're going to be interested in are conventional ones. Why are you going to get into the risky types of participation when you believe you can be effective and you believe the system will listen to you? You won't, right? You'll do the conventional forms of political participation. If we move down, right here, we have people that have a high level of political trust and a low level of political efficacy. Okay. The system will listen to them, they believe, but they don't think they have the ability or the ability mainly to make a difference. But if they did get involved, they would get involved in conventional participation because political trust is high, right? The system will listen to them, right? So this is high trust and high efficacy up here. This is high trust and low efficacy. Come over here to participate, no participation. Low trust, low efficacy. I can't make a difference, and even if I tried, the system wouldn't respond. So I'm just not going to do anything, right? I'm opting out, right? It's just, I'm dejected, I'm depressed, I can't make a difference. And even if I did, it would be too hard, right, to get the system to respond. So I'm just not going to do anything. So I don't vote. I just opt out. And then the final and interesting group of people here, right? People have a high level of political efficacy, but a low level of political trust. Right? The system doesn't want to listen to me. I'm going to grab it by the throat and make it listen to me. Right? These are the people that the unconventional forms of political participation are an option, right? They're the ones that are going to look at civil disobedience. They're the ones that are going to look at radical protest that destroy property or injure people or, right, threaten to overthrow the government or something like that, right? Because they're going to make a difference and the system is going to listen to them. They don't think it wants to, so they're going to take more extreme action, but they're still going to shake it, the foundations. Does this make sense? Any questions? Well, it looks like I misled y'all on getting done early. That was unintentional, but this is our last slide, and so we're done for the day. Your test starts in 10 minutes. The window opens. You can, right, the rest of April 1st and then all of 2nd and all of April 3rd, you have the opportunity to take your test. So study, right, do well, knock it out of the park. We'll see some A's. I got nothing else for today if you're done. Same as the first one, I think it's 30 questions or so, right? Iris is asking for me to talk more, right? No, I thought good, Riley. Go do well on the test. If you got questions, right, feel free to email me or text me or something. I'll help you as much as I can without giving you answers on the test. And I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.